there are some decisions that we have to make before we even start designing. And the first is whether our component is generic or specific. And this really depends on the scope of your design system and your product setup. Let me explain what I mean by those terms. This is what a generic component might look like. And it's basically where we try to cover every single one of our use cases. And so what we want to do is allow it to be composable. So what we can see is we can say, okay, so you can have this date picker input. It can be big, it can be small. The calendar can be, again, big or small. We can move the arrows to be aligned on the right. We can add a quick select panel. One component to cover every one of these use cases would be a generic component. And specific components, on the other hand, this is a component where it literally just does one thing. And we might call this pre-composed, because it's absolutely ready to go. You can drag this thing out, put it straight in, and there you go, Cool. So what are the pros and cons of the two approaches? And for a generic one, it's really easily extendable. We've got all of those different setups. We can easily change things. And it also covers every little bit of our usage, But the cons here are really that it's quite slow to build, you have to cover all of those use cases. You have to do your research really, really, really well. And the final con is that it's also a bit of a complex component, like to actually use, But then when we move over to specific, it's kind of inverted. It's fast to build and it's simple to use. There's not really much to the component. But the cons are that it's actually kind of hard to extend. If we've just covered one use case really well, then when a new requirement comes in, it might actually just break that component completely. And it only covers, like I said, one usage. All right, so now on to actually building. And my advice here is to start with the smallest things. I think usually you'll have some existing foundations like color, spacing, sizing, typography. And if you're working on a larger system that needs them, you might also have something called design tokens. I'm not going to go too deeply into design tokens today, but I can tell you that basically what they are is an abstraction of styles into reusable variables. And so something like this might be the text size. We've got down here, you can see a $, which is the typical way to indicate it, which is like input text large. That might be a design token. Something else that we might consider is going to be subcomponents. And these are components that are inside the component. And I think a really good example here is if we look to the right-hand side of our input, we've got the input buttons there. We've got this sort of like clear button and also the calendar button. And so that is a component in its own right, but it's completely contained inside our input. We probably wouldn't expose this component to be used in sort of anywhere else. It's just native to the calendar, native to the data input.